We interrupt this program from Seattle, Washington to bring you this breaking news story from BLNC, the Big Lie News Corporation. I'm Dick Veneer, your friendly anchor of Facade News, the 24/7 news service that's dedicated to keeping you in the dark. We go straight to the surface of a story and we stay there. No one can beat our in-shallow reporting. Ladies and gentlemen, according to an obscure radio station in Washington State, KUOW, they are reporting that the former American president, George W. Bush, has been arrested. He was found in a spider hole near Mount Rainier and taken into custody by Afghan and Iraqi mujahideen. The American president, handcuffed, his head covered with a black cloak and in a bright orange jumpsuit, was shouting at his captors, "I am the leader of the free world. I do God's work on earth." And then he burst into tears and said, "I want my dad." The former American president will be handed over to the International Criminal Court in The Hague, where he's being charged with the supreme crime of the planning and waging of aggressive war. If convicted, he faces 7 consecutive life terms to be served at Guantanamo. You will recall that the infamous U.S. prison was returned to Cuban sovereignty in the year 2007. And Bush will be joined by a veritable rogue gallery of other state criminals, including Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, Douglas Feith, Alberto Gonzales, Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell, and Donald Rumsfeld. In addition to the charge he faces in The Hague, U.S. courts have also issued warrants for the former American president for violations of the U.S. Constitution, the 1996 War Powers Act, the 1978 Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, and the UN Charter, and the 1949 Geneva Conventions. All in all, it looks like curtains for Bush, who, as he was led away, was whimpering, "Dick, Dick, Dick, where are you, Dick?" Stay tuned to Facade and BLNC, the Big Lies News Corporation, for updates on this important breaking story. I'm your still friendly anchor, Dick Veneer. Remember, we're guided by the highest journalistic principles. We deceive, you believe. You either watch our news or you're with the terrorists. And now back to our regularly scheduled program at Elliott Bay Books in Seattle, Washington. Well, good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me here and turning out. It's wonderful to be back in Seattle and also to be here at Elliott Bay Bookstore, one of the major resistance points to the borderization of bookstores across the country, the tidal wave of Barnes and ignobilization and borders that have been driving out independent bookstores. And I like independent bookstores. First of all, they invite me. Barnes and Nobles and Borders do not really entertain radical voices, and they're rather, how should I say it, timid and tepid bookstores. And it's places like this where there's some oxygen, there's some possibility of getting your lungs re-aerified and getting some of that toxic waste drudged up and expurgated. But it's really important to support independent bookstores, and I know when on the occasions I do go into some of these corporate stores and ask for Howard Zinn, and they say, "What's that?" Or Chomsky, and you're met with a complete blank face, and it's here you get in stores like this where you get some attention and also some knowledge. And, I love literature. And, if you want to understand what's going on today with U.S. foreign policy and in the country, there's no better book than Moby Dick by Melville or Graham Greene's The Quiet American. These are, really excellent books to understand things about like hubris and arrogance and the infallibility of power. Greene's book is set, for example, in, I know I should be talking about my own books, right? But here I am promoting novels. Greene's book is set in Saigon in 1955, just as the French have been eased out and the Americans are about to come in. And the main character is a guy named Alden Pyle. And he's this can-do, know-it-all, smart as the Dickens American, full of arrogance and very dismissive of the British and the French, saying, we're Americans. We'll do it better. We're smarter. We're not going to make the mistakes you made. We're on the ball. We're in touch with, the grassroots and on and on. And of course, Greene was prophetic in deciphering that arrogance and hubris, and what was to lead to, an involvement in Indochina that's lasted until 1975, and that spread from Vietnam to Laos and Cambodia. So literature is always an important way to understand things. I think Milan Kundera in the Book of Laughter and Forgetting says, the struggle of man against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. And so much of the problems that people have and we have as a culture in the United States is a lack of information, a lack of knowledge about our own history. So when American presidents get on the television or in front of usually electronic Nuremberg rallies, as I call them, because time and time again, have you noticed the president addressing military troops, National Guard, reserves, other forms of militarism with lots of flags, and it's kind of an electronic Nuremberg rally. And he, proclaims that the United States, believes in democracy and never attacks countries, but there are occasional exceptions. Well, we can, look at, if you know a little bit of history, as Howard Zinn says, we know that the United States routinely attacks countries that does not threaten it, or conducts coups d'etats in countries that are not threatening it. The record begins right at the end of World War II, when the U.S. assumed the role of the global hegemon and supplanted the British Empire as the world superpower. It starts with the passing of the National Security Act in 1947, which created the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Council, effectively creating a national security state within the United States. And there was an immediate intervention in Greece and in Turkey to defeat an insurgency led by left formations. There was also the crushing of labor unions in Italy and France. I mean, this is all like the hidden history of the United States that, is not usually taught in most schools, but I think should be front and center in any discussion of politics and American history. And the record since then has been unblemished, a continued pattern of aggression and attacks, overthrowing democratically elected governments in Iran in 1953, a major event in the history of the Middle East, and in particularly in Iran, which is having repercussions and ramifications until this day, overthrowing Mohammad Mossadegh, a popular, democratically elected leader of Iran, who had a very funny idea. He thought that the oil and natural gas reserves in his country should benefit the people of his country. Why would he think something like that? Didn't he know it belongs to the major Western oil corporations that controlled it? So he was overthrown in a coup d'etat, Operation Ajax in 1953, led by Theodore Roosevelt's grandson, Kermit. The following year, another coup d'etat overthrowing a democratically elected government in Guatemala of Jacobo Arbenz, who is really radical. He was influenced by FDR's New Deal. I see there are a few people here who might remember FDR and the New Deal. It was a Marxist-Leninist program. You know, it threw everyone in work camps here. It indoctrinated people and, you know, eliminated all political prisoners. You know, it was quite an amazing experiment in U.S. democracy in the 1930s and early 1940s, overthrowing democratically elected governments in the Dominican Republic like Juan Bosch, creating a coup d'etat in Indonesia in 1965, which led to 32 years of a military dictatorship under Suharto, which was also responsible for the invasion and occupation of East Timor, the suppression of an Aceh liberation movement in Sumatra, overthrowing Salvador Allende in Chile in 1973, attacking Grenada, attacking Noriega because Noriega was a threat to the national security of the United States, undermining the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua because the Sandinistas were only 2 days' drive from Harlingen, Texas, and posed a threat to the national security. In fact, Reagan declared, without anyone laughing, he declared that Nicaragua posed a national security emergency for the United States. And this cuts through Democrats, Republicans, or as we have today, Republicrats and Demopublicans. It's right across party lines. It's a bipartisan interventionist policy. It's all done under the rubric and the feel-good words of democracy, liberation, freedom. I mean, who can find fault with those words? I mean, you can't tell people, you know, we're attacking you for your oil, we're going to rip you off for your resources, for your natural gas, for your tin, for your copper, for your tungsten. That's not going to play very well. It would be hard to write a Hollywood film that a lot of people would go to see. But if you tell people enough times, as you know, Hitler perfected in the 30s and 40s, and as Goebbels as his propaganda meister, also developed, the more you repeat something, the more likely people will believe it. And the bigger the lie, the more likely it is to be believed. So Hitler, the Nazis used to say, with constant repetition, we could convince people that heaven is hell and hell is heaven, that a square is a circle and a circle is a square. And Goebbels, I think, said it best. When you think about our own media, which seems to be incredibly diverse and offer, all kinds of possibilities, he said the purpose of Nazi propaganda was to present an ostensible diversity behind which lies an actual uniformity. So you think what you see with 550 channels on cable TV, that there's lots of diversity there. But in fact, if you look carefully and peel away the layers of deceit and deception and propaganda, there's a much more uniformity than a diversity. So one of the reasons I began my radio project in Boulder, Colorado, which is celebrating its 20th year this year, and we kicked off on March 25th with a big celebration in New York's Carnegie Hall, which was sold out. The Kronos Quartet and Howard Zinn and myself. That was the first, of a series of events. A couple of weeks later, again in New York at CUNY, I did an event with Robert Fisk. And so AR began because I was fed up with the corporate media. I was sick and tired of the lies, the distortions, the propaganda, and the superficiality of it, the endless, I call them weapons of mass distraction. We need UN inspectors to label and control the kind of toxicity that's produced by the corporate media. They do pose a serious health hazard to our population. If you are exposed to corporate media for many hours without any regulation or any sense of moderation, it's quite likely that you will feel some dis-ease. I don't know what forms they may take, but you see a lot of people getting very depressed, very full of cynicism and pessimism and despair. And, I've suggested that the Surgeon General label corporate media products, maybe with a scroll. So as you see Sean Hannity or Brian Williams or Larry King or Katie Couric or whomever on TV, underneath you'll see, if you watch this for more than 60 seconds, it will cause migraine headaches in children. Or this program is dangerous for pregnant women. This will cause stomach aches. Then we might have a better sense, of proportion and the lethality of poison that's generated by these, images and endless focusing on, the latest Hollywood scandal or what's happening with Barry Bonds. Did he take steroids or not? If he did, then should we recognize his home run record? Does he deserve to go into the Hall of Fame? Well, Pete Rose was kept out, and he gambled, so, Bonds shouldn't be allowed into the Hall of Fame. And then, of course, you have Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie about to have a baby. How does Jen Aniston feel about that? She used to be pretty close to Brad Pitt. Is she having problems? Let's have an in-depth investigation and discussion with Geraldo, flying to wherever, flying to Aruba. It's really interesting to see that these people can actually do journalism, although it is in totally superficial and inconsequential areas. For example, I just mentioned Aruba, so that triggered off the memory of Natalie Holloway, a poor middle-class American girl, blonde, beautiful, kidnapped, and who has been missing in Aruba. And so not just Geraldo, but many of the others, even Diane Sawyer, who used to be a journalist, they all fly to Aruba, not a bad place to land, and they're doing, I saw Geraldo, interviewing the police chief, and he wouldn't let the police chief off the spot. He said, you mean to stand there, after 3 weeks, after 3 months of investigation, your police force on this tiny island has been unable to come up with a single shred of evidence as to what happened to this poor American girl? You mean to stand there and tell me you have no case? You're not developing leads? What's going on here? And then, the police chief is like, well, we're doing our best. We don't have, a lot of resources. This is not the United States. What do you mean this is, a straightforward murder and kidnapping? What's going on here? And, he was just like pounding this guy. Now, if you think, why don't they talk to Cheney or Bush or Rice or any of the people with power in this country in the same manner? I wonder what's going on there. And I think what you find, of course, after very cursory examination, and one of the things I learned from Chomsky is that this work that we're doing, this is clerical work. I mean, it's not organic chemistry, it's not studying the ablative case in Sanskrit or neurosurgery. Ablative case in Sanskrit, actually, I have studied and I could not master it. It is so difficult. But beyond that, or Pahlavi, ancient Persian. These are not, such easy things to do. It's rather straightforward. It's clerical work. You see, who gets on these programs, what institutions they represent, what questions they ask, and you just do the math. You add it up. Fairness and accuracy in reporting, for example, in the lead up to the Iraq War, did a study of the 4 major newscasts, including the Snooze Hour with Jim Lehrer. You'll remember Jim Lehrer. I'll come back to him perhaps later. And they found 393 guests appeared talking about Iraq. This is before the attack. And of those 393, 389 were pro-war. Only 4 had an opinion that, war may not be the answer. Or maybe Iraq doesn't have weapons of mass destruction. Or maybe attacking Iraq will ignite more terrorism. Well, we've seen, in fact, that is the case. By the State Department's own account which I think is undercounted. There were 11,000 incidents of terrorism in 2005 alone. I'm sure 2006 will probably break that record as well. So it was the limiting of information. And one of the ways propaganda operates in our system, it's rather clever. They do have debates. There is conflict and contention, but it's within a very narrow framework. So before the attack on Iraq, you would see the experts, and let's talk about the snooze hour on PBS, the Petroleum Broadcasting Service, because the big oil companies support PBS as much or as more than Cargill and Archer Daniels Midland, the big agribusiness corporations. You would see on the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer, which is considered, a very respectable program. People are very reasonable. They say, good evening, welcome to the program. It's good to see you again. Very polite. There's no crosstalk. It's not like, the shout shows of, the McLaughlin Group or Hannity and Combs and some of the Joe Scarborough and some of the others. Very dignified, very erudite. People speak in complete sentences. They seem to know English and always remember to use predicates and adverbs correctly. And if you look at all of their guests, and this continues right to this moment with Iran, the same kind of discussion. Before the attack on Iraq, it was, how should we do it? It was all about instrumentalities. Should we invade from Turkey? Should it be a pincer movement from the West? Should it be troops coming up from Kuwait? Should there be parachute landings? Should it be airborne? Should it be amphibious landings of Marines on the southern coast of Iraq, up the Shatt al-Arab River? And that was oh, no, we can't do that. We've got to start with a bombing campaign. This was the opposing point of view. We have to have a sustained carpet bombing campaign of all Iraqi military positions. So when our brave men and women in uniform, that is one phrase that is right. Brave men and women in uniform, before they're put in harm's way, another part of that formulaic expression that is repeated like a mantra, they will be, much safer. In a much easier combat position because we've conducted this extensive bombing campaign. And so that was it. That was the debate. No one talked about whether, is this legal under the U.S. Constitution? Under what authority is the president unilaterally taking United States troops into war with a few allies in tow? What about the War Powers Act of 1996? What about the Geneva Conventions? Are Iraqis going to be treated as prisoners of war or unlawful combatants, as the Afghan Mujahideen and the Taliban are still being treated as unlawful combatants? A new creation, a new invention in the history of international jurisprudence. And there was simply no debate. The New York Times, that other Marxist-Leninist newspaper, it's really the organ of the left. It's actually controlled by people like me and Chomsky and Howard Zinn and Angela Davis, Michael Parenti, Black Panthers. Mumia Abu-Jamal edits it from his prison cell in Pennsylvania on death row. It's totally run by us. But we like to, we're modest people, so we like to have these, these media institutions as a kind of facade in front of us. And there's a very interesting study of 70 New York Times editorials from September 11th, 2001 until the attack on Iraq, March 19th, 2003. It's in another book, not mine, but I refer to it in my Chomsky book, Imperial Ambitions, which is over there. And that it's called The Record of the Paper. Obviously a takeoff on the paper of record, which is what the Times calls itself. It's written by Howard Friel, F-R-I-E-L, and Richard Falk, F-A-L-K. And they found in these 70 editorials in our most distinguished, our most prestigious newspaper, which has a global reputation, in not one of the 70 editorials it had on Iraq were the terms international law or United Nations Charter or the Nuremberg Principles ever mentioned once. So if you had read, as I did, any of those editorials and were unaware of those antecedents in international law, you would have been unaware that what the Bush administration was proposing was a major international war crime, not very different from the German attack on Holland or the Soviet Union or Greece or Yugoslavia or France or Norway. And in fact, in 1945 at Nuremberg, Robert Jackson, a very distinguished American jurist, a former Supreme Court justice, he was appointed by FDR. He was talking to the surviving members, the accused elite of the German bureaucracy, as well as the German Wehrmacht and the SS. And he was telling them, because they were screaming from the dock, that this is victor's justice. The only reason we're here is because we lost the war. And Jackson told them, in words almost I'm repeating verbatim, the reason you are here is because you started the war, because you attacked countries that were not threatening you. Well, what does that sound like? That sounds like the United States attacking Grenada in 1983, or attacking Vietnam in the early 1960s, using the bogus Gulf of Tonkin resolution, an incident that never happened in the Gulf of Tonkin, used by Lyndon Johnson to ram through a resolution in Congress in early August 1964, which passed in the House of Representatives 416-0, and in the Senate 98-2. The only two senators that had the wisdom and the courage to stand up against Johnson were Ernest Gruning of Alaska and Wayne Morse of neighboring Oregon. I thought at the time, I was already pretty active politically. The year before at the Presidio in San Francisco, I was leafleting, and I looked at the leaflet. It was Armed Forces Day. We were handing out maps of Indochina so that people could understand, geographically where it was. And, U.S. advisors were already in large numbers in Vietnam, sent there by the liberal democratic paragon, John F. Kennedy. And I knew something about Vietnam, and I thought, why would Vietnam provoke an incident of this magnitude with the most powerful country, with the most powerful military in the world? I mean, I knew something about Vietnam's economy. It had no air force. It had no navy. And they were attacking U.S. battle cruisers on the open sea? I mean, it strains credulity. I mean, this is not, I'm not like a PhD from Harvard in political science or anything. This is just common sense. Why would a country of this, as small as Vietnam, with so few resources, provoke an incident like this? And I was thinking, well, what did they do? How did they attack the U.S. destroyers? With kayaks, canoes, rowboats? Maybe they went out there in rowboats and threw caps at them or something. And what was, of course, has come out subsequently is, number one, the U.S. battleships were in Vietnamese territorial waters, already, a crime of aggression, and that there was no such incident. McNamara has now acknowledged this. The Pentagon Papers hinted at it. We know for a fact that there was no such incident. But it was used by Johnson 24/7, Gulf of Tonkin, we were attacked, we have to defend ourselves. Does that sound like something else? September 11th, we were attacked, 24/7, 9/11, we have to defend ourselves. Whenever Bush, Cheney, or Rumsfeld is asked a question about anything, it's always about 9/11. Somehow 9/11 gets in the answer. Well, do you remember September 11th? Do you remember the 3,000? Do you remember the planes hitting the building? In other words, shut up. Suspend your minds, suspend critical thinking, and follow the leader. Be obedient. And you see the patterns of history. And as Zinn says, if you know history, then you have a tool to fight back with. And what did Johnson do? He used the Gulf of Tonkin resolution to expand a war in Indochina, which turned sour against him, of course, and he resigns in 1968. Nixon comes into office after the Tet Offensive, after this huge uprising in Vietnam. What does he do after announcing he has a plan to end the war in Vietnam? He expands the war. He moves into Cambodia and then Laos, resulting in the death of 25,000 additional American troops and possibly 3 million Cambodians, Laotians, and Vietnamese. Again, another major war crime. And we see now the exact same pattern happening in the Middle East. As Iraq is going up in flames, as Afghanistan is unraveling, what are they thinking of doing? Attacking Iran. To get, to again whip up the population into some hysterical frenzy. We're surrounded by enemies. Here they come. You hear the rhetoric. It's pronounced by, Condoleezza Rice. Iran is the central bank of terrorism. It is a country to be loathed. This is a country with thousands of years of history. Iran, no greater threat to the United States security. Rumsfeld, Iran is the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. Bush, Iran is the world's primary state sponsor of terrorism. You see how they just see the variety there? Rumsfeld said leading. They're coached. You change an adjective. Spice it up a little bit. Otherwise, people might think you're reading from a script. That you're staying on message. And of course, that's absurd because we know what sagacious and brilliant and erudite leaders are guiding our foreign policy. I guess I'm just very cynical. Look, I'll hold this close to the microphone because we're being recorded for radio. A recent Newsweek cover showing a very menacing photograph of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the president of Iran, with the question, how dangerous is Iran, the next nuclear threat, radical Islam in power. If you look back over covers of Newsweek, U.S. News, World Report, and Time, you find the exact same scowling, sneering image, but it's Saddam Hussein, or it's Osama bin Laden, or it's Yasser Arafat, or some other person in the Middle East. It seems, I guess, these people never smile when they're photographed, or no photographs are available showing them, maybe with their kids or grandchildren, or, maybe cooking a kebab, or, having a picnic somewhere. They're always scowling, in a permanent, state of anger because, that's them over there, as Edward Said said, the constructed Muslim, this artificial monolith that's been created of Islam which has replaced now, conveniently, the Soviet Union as the supreme enemy of the United States. You have to justify a $600 billion Pentagon budget. You have to justify $10 billion a month being spent in Iraq, $2 billion a month being spent in Afghanistan, while our schools don't have teachers or our libraries are being closed. If you can, again, scare the people enough, they'll go along. It was very interesting. I mentioned 1947. Truman is the president, and he is proposing the National Security Act. He's proposing the militarization of the United States economy. And, people, this is after World War II, where the U.S. is, in the supreme military power and is not under any threat whatsoever directly. And Senator Arthur Vandenberg, who's, I think, from California, a conservative, that used to be a term of honor in the United States, but now it is a term of questionable distinction. Conservatives used to be people who lived within their means, balanced budgets, didn't get involved, like to get involved in foreign entanglements. People like Taft and, they're kind of dinosaurs now. I mean, the crew that's in power now, the regime in Washington, takes the term conservative, but there is nothing conservative about their economic or their political policies. It's quite radical and it's quite nationalistic. and it's quite on the behalf of Halliburton, ExxonMobil, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, and the other big military industrial contractors and the petrochemical complex. Let's not forget ConocoPhillips, Texon, ExxonMobil, Chevron, Texaco, ConocoPhillips, BP, and Shell. Those are the big five. As we have five media corporations that control what most people see, hear, and read in the United States, it's AOL, Time Warner, that's CNN. It's Viacom, that's CBS. There's News Corporation, that's Fox. There's ABC, Disney, ABC, and General Electric, straight out military contractor controlling NBC. So as we have five major media corporations, we have five major petrochemical corporations that dominate the oil and natural gas field, as it were. So are you feeling any pain as you're pumping at the gas stations lately? 305, 310, 325. I was in LA last week, 335, 340. Somebody's getting rich off of rising gas prices. It couldn't be the oil companies. It couldn't be ExxonMobil, which last year scored the greatest single profit in the history of capitalism, of any single corporation, $36 billion net. That was take home. That was not gross. But you can relax. You can, feel some sense of joy and elation. They're going to bust through that record this year. Already in the first quarter, their profits are somewhere around $15 billion. So they will well exceed last year's record. And this is true also for the major military contractors. I mentioned Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, Honeywell, General Electric, Sikorsky. They're making money hand over fist, compliments of what is the well-known cash cow, the Pentagon, which gives out these incredible contracts, particularly in Iraq. If anyone ever run a small business here or works for himself or herself, the dream contract from the government is one that is no bid and cost plus. So you have no competition when you've submitted what is probably a hugely inflated figure for, doing some construction job in Iraq or Afghanistan. And then whatever, expenses you incur along the way, you just tack it on the bill and you get paid. I mean, this is, a dream contract. And that's what Halliburton has had. That's what Bechtel has had. That's what Blackwell has had, and Titan, and DynCorp, and all of the other war profiteering multinational corporations, all of the ones I just named, all U.S. Corporations that are making a killing in Iraq. And Afghanistan as well. I don't want to leave Afghanistan off the radar screen. Last year, more Afghans and U.S. and NATO troops were killed than in the previous 3 years combined. And I've been talking to Ahmed Rashid of Pakistan, who's the guy who wrote Taliban, who's very knowledgeable about Afghanistan. And he said the insurgency, the Mujahideen, Al-Qaeda, Taliban, these are different formations, they're not the same, is growing and expanding in Afghanistan as well. And you can look, it's hard to use this term, you could look forward to more insurgent activity in Afghanistan as well. And of course, Iraq is completely out of control. And that's all the more reason to launch another distraction and to attack Iran. All the more reason when a president is being threatened by the possibility of impeachment. This is kind of being, whispered in the shadows. If the Democrats take control of the House, there's a possibility that the House Judiciary Committee, which is the only legal entity that can initiate impeachment proceedings, in fact launches an impeachment inquiry. So how to keep the House safe and the Senate safe, launch a war against Iran, wave the flag, beat your breast, have electronic Nuremberg rallies in front of troops saying, hoo-ha, hoo-ha. And, and Bush saying, I can hear the speeches now, Cheney, Bush, Rumsfeld in unison, and Rice, they'll change one or two words, saying, this is no time to change course. If you vote for the Democrats, that's a message to Al-Qaeda that we're weak, that we're going to cut and run. We're quitters. You can already hear, the rhetoric and the speeches. You don't even have to make it up. Just a couple of weeks ago, Rumsfeld said, to leave Iraq today would be to run from Iraq today, not to leave, but to run from Iraq today would be like leaving Nazi Germany at the end of World War II and leaving Germany at the end of World War II and turning it back to the Nazis. Again, always, using this kind of rhetoric. I'm about to produce a program with Robert Fisk, the Middle East correspondent of The Independent. I've done several programs with him. Alternativeradio.org is my website. You can check these things out. He's a very solid, knowledgeable reporter who does not practice drive-by journalism, like three-day journalism. You go to a country, you meet people that speak English, usually trained at Harvard or Princeton or Columbia, and then you come back or you write a few articles, and that's your journalism, that's your report. Fisk has actually been based in Beirut for almost 30 years, and so I'm going to do a program with him, and I'm calling it Official Sources Say. And this is based on a little piece that he and we did this event in New York on April 8th at CUNY. He had this article from the LA Times. It's on Iraq, and it refers to one of the things you always see whenever any Al-Qaeda or Mujahideen or Taliban person, whatever rank he or she is, he or she is always referred to as senior. They're always senior. Taliban have been captured. Senior Al-Qaeda members have been captured. When the United States bombed Pakistan in a violation of its sovereignty on January 15th or 16th, 2006, in which 19 Pakistanis were killed, supposedly 5 senior Al-Qaeda were among those 19 killed. No evidence has been presented to support the allegation that 5 senior Al-Qaeda were killed. There's been no DNA. There's been no, forensic evidence forthcoming, and none will be forthcoming, because if the great leader says it, then it's true. It's like Orwell and Big Brother. If it's pronounced from on high, you are to believe. Very much like the Big Lie News Corporation or Fox TV, which is better known as Goebbels TV. Not uninteresting that Tony Snow, a former Fox, you can't call them journalists, stenographers would be closer to it, is now the presidential press secretary. I mean, it's perfect. It's totally rational, and I think it says a lot about that cheek and jowl relationship between what was once called the Fourth Estate. And so. And the other word, sorry, I'm a double Gemini, so I don't think sequentially. And it's a problem, and that's why I barely graduated from high school, because I could not even answer questions. I'd start at number 16, then I'd go to 4, I'd go to 7, and then I wouldn't answer the ones I didn't like. So I wasn't a successful student, and I caused my mother much grief. But anyway, I went to summer school and managed to graduate from high school. The other term is senior. The other term that's used all the time is mastermind. Everyone's a mastermind. That, Bin Laden is a mastermind, Zawahiri is a mastermind, Zarqawi is a mastermind. There are no Mr. Minds or little minds. They're just masterminds. Okay, well, let's leave that. Maybe it's some lexical quirk. Or maybe their thesaurus is just locked on those two terms, senior and mastermind. Well, here's the story on Iraq by Josh Meyer and Mark Mazzetti. Right? Dateline, Washington. Excellent. For a story on Iraq, Dateline, Washington. Here are it's about Zarqawi, and here it starts with, here are the sources of this story. This is Fisk now speaking. Column 1, U.S. authorities say. U.S. officials said. Column 2, officials said. U.S. authorities say. U.S. officials say. Page A10 continues. Several U.S. officials said. Those officials said. The officials confirmed. American officials complained. Column 2, they said. U.S. officials stressed. Column 3, U.S. authorities believe. Said one senior U.S. intelligence official. Little variety there. It's good. Creates a little texture. Continuing, you mustn't laugh. U.S. officials said. Jordanian officials said. Now you're getting some geographical diversity. This is rich. This is not Saturday Night Live writing. It's not Jon Stewart. This is the LA Times, right? Column 4, several U.S. officials said. Column 6, officials say U.S. officials, but U.S. officials said. One U.S. counterterrorism official said. So if you read the story, it is just an endless, official sources say, and that speaks, I think, volumes to what's happened to American journalism, over the last few decades. And it's been a steady decline. I wrote a book a few years ago. Unfortunately, there's not a copy of it here. It's called A Decline and Fall of Public Broadcasting. And, that decline and fall, the trajectory has been even sharper in recent years. I realize this is probably going to be broadcast on a National Public Radio affiliate, but National Public Radio News, I think, has been less than stellar in its reporting on the Middle East. Let me just put it in those terms. It has not really done a good job, and it's not surprising. They don't have people who speak Farsi or Urdu or Arabic or Turkish, and they're there for short periods of time. And even the people that are here in the States, people like Leanne Hansen or Juan Williams, either don't know the issues or the history of the Middle East or don't care to know. It's hard to say. I can't ascribe any motive to that, but you have Juan Williams, for example, interviewing Dick Cheney in January of 2004, and Cheney said, "We found weapons of mass destruction." And Williams didn't say a word. The interview continued. More recently, Juan Williams did an interview with Condoleezza Rice. You can hear it on the NPR website and read the text as well, in which we learned that she was a very gifted classical pianist, that she had studied classical music for years and years, and that she could have been a major performer, but she was called by the lure of public service and decided to go into government, and there wasn't a single question about Iraq. Here's one of the architects of the attack on Iraq, and no questions about Iraq. Why? Rather amazing. Or Leanne Hansen, 5 or 6 Sundays ago, maybe it was in March of 2006, she's on, what is it called, the weekend edition, Sunday edition. That Scott Simon is on Saturday with weekend edition, Leanne Hansen on Sunday, talking to Kenneth Pollock, someone who should not be on the air. He should not be even interviewed. He was so discredited for his misinformation about Iraq. He wrote a book called The Threatening Storm, which was riddled with errors and mistakes. It was one of the major instruments that was used by the liberals to yoke themselves to the Bush war chariot on Iraq, because Kenneth Pollock was a member of Clinton's National Security Council. And then he became a pundit at the Brookings Institution, which is regarded as kind of centrist, or even leftist in Washington. And here's someone who's totally wrong on Iraq being interviewed on what topic? Iraq. Again, they couldn't find Scott Ritter. They can't find Noam Chomsky. Maybe he's unknown. Maybe they don't know he teaches at MIT. Maybe they don't know Howard Zinn lives in Boston. Maybe they can't find these people. Somehow I find them with no resources. I pick up the phone. They answer the phone directly. You don't even have to go through, circles of receptionists and PR people to get to them. So, it's making a little effort also to get some dirt under your fingernails, as Bob McChesney, a former graduate of UW and Evergreen, once said. It's getting some dirt under your fingernails. It's doing some investigation. We've had all this pro-attack on Iraq, rhetoric. We've had all these guests now, again, attacking Iran. Maybe we should find someone else. Maybe we should find some Iranian voices who might not think it's a good idea. Maybe some other people from the Middle East. Maybe, Afghans or Turks, people in the region that might be affected by yet another, expansion of U.S. military violence. It's not happening. It's not there. We don't, what are the reasons for this? It's difficult to say. And, maybe it's an area to study, but I myself don't have a lot of time to do that kind of scholarship, as to motivation and why things happen the way they do. But all we can do, or what I can do, is this clerical work. We see who they have on, how often they appear, what institutions they represent, and draw certain conclusions from that. They cannot find dissident voices. Yeah. So I was asked to limit my remarks to 3.5 hours because I'm speaking actually at 7 o'clock this evening at another event, and then 2 events tomorrow morning at a Unitarian church, and then tomorrow evening at 6:30 at the University Baptist Church. It's a benefit for Eat the State, which is a wonderful radical paper that comes out of Seattle that deserves your support if you don't know about it. If you know a little bit of history, you're able to, talk back and fight back. If you know that Donald Rumsfeld, I'm holding this close to the microphone again, here is shaking hands with none other than Saddam Hussein in 1983, and Tariq Aziz is on one side. This was the first of 2 meetings with Saddam Hussein that Donald Rumsfeld held. He was Reagan's special envoy to the Middle East. Today, Rumsfeld, when asked, claims that he cannot remember meeting Saddam Hussein. It's plausible. I guess, he meets Iraqi heads of state so frequently that it's hard to keep track, particularly one who was a major war criminal at the time and was also a significant U.S. ally. As a direct result of these meetings with Saddam Hussein, Iraq was taken off the State Department list of terrorist states. Cuba was added, an incredible irony, the country that's been subjected perhaps to more state-directed terrorism than any other, certainly in the Western Hemisphere, all coming from the United States, bombing, shooting down of airliners, using chemical weapons against Cuban crops, trying to infect animal livestock animals in Cuba, et cetera, et cetera. Cuba is put on the list. Iraq is taken off. This is at the height of the use of chemical weapons against Iranians, which you'll notice in the lead up to the Iraq attack, the Bush administration was constantly talking about. Iran was a victim of Iraqi use of weapons of mass destruction. You all remember that. It was used constantly. And of course, Halabja. But as a result of these meetings and the new rapprochement with Iraq and the United States, billions and billions of dollars of aid flowed from Washington straight to Baghdad, much of it in the form of agricultural credits, which were used to buy chlorine and ammonium nitrate and other ingredients to make weapons of mass destruction that were then used against Halabja, the Kurds, flying U.S.-supplied helicopters. And at the time, the Reagan administration said nothing about this atrocity in Halabja. It was, of course, later that it was described as such. This kind of information, this kind of analysis, the double standards that seemed so transparent, these are very well known in the Middle East. I've spent a lot of time recently in Turkey, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Egypt, in Jordan, and this is what people are talking about. In Syria, you know what people are talking about? When are we going to get the Golan Heights back from Israel? Stolen from us in 1967, annexed into Israeli territory in violation of UN Security Council resolutions. When was the last time anyone even heard the term Golan Heights and Syria even mentioned? I dare say, unless you're a scholar or someone nutty like me that tries to read everything, it's been months, if not years. It has disappeared. It has gone down the memory hole. So when the U.S. is talking about, UN Security Council resolutions, adherence to international law, people in the third world are going like this. They're just wondering. I mean, this sounds like hypocrisy, not democracy. It's like Michael Parenti said, are we making the world safe for democracy or hypocrisy? Well, another world is possible. That's kind of the theme of this nonstop marathon I've been running for the last 3 or 4 months, crisscrossing the country and Canada as well. And that's the theme of the World Social Forum, which began in Porto Alegre, Brazil. And another world is not only possible, it's absolutely necessary because it's become a matter of survival of the species, of the planet, if we're actually going to continue. If we continue with this path of plunder and destruction, environmental degradation, and dedicated to power and profit and imperialism, which is a term that you will never hear on the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer or Charlie Rose or Morning Edition or All Things Considered or any other single newscast in the United States. You will only hear that word when it's coupled with British, French, Dutch, Belgium, Roman, but never with the adjective American. Because what we're doing is a different project. We're doing democracy, liberation, and freedom, and helping people. Occasionally flawed, here and there, tragic mistakes were made, always using the passive voice, so you never know who made these mistakes. But basically our heart's in the right place, and, you have to have faith in whatever Washington is doing. Outside the U.S., the view is so completely different. And it's so valuable. I think a lot of you probably, you live in Seattle. You're able to travel to Asia, to the Middle East, even to Canada. You don't have to go far. You could just go to Vancouver. Read Adbusters, which I think is available here. The CBC is even slightly better than NPR in some respects. So, sample the international media, diversify your sources of information, be skeptical but not cynical, because cynical is demobilizing, it's disempowering, it's paralytic, and it's like that, doesn't matter, who cares, why bother, who's listening. If I thought that, I never would have started this radio project in Boulder years ago. And my own brother, we're from New York, he said, "What are you, nuts? Somebody's going to buy these tapes after they listen to it free on the radio? What are you, crazy?" And if I would have listened to him and everyone else who said, "Why bother? You're not going to get anywhere with this," I wouldn't have started alternative radio. Amy Goodman wouldn't have started Democracy Now! The people that started Eat the State wouldn't have started that. Z Magazine wouldn't have started The Progressive, Seven Stories Press, South End Press, Deep Dish TV in New York, Free Speech TV in Boulder. All of these new media institutions that have sprung up in the last 20 years. Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting began in New York. I mentioned that organization earlier. So it's important to keep one's spirits up, and this is National Poetry Month. So I want to read a poem because I think art is always important in terms of expanding our intellectual and cultural horizons. Yeah, I know I want you to read Chomsky. I want you to buy my book with Tariq Ali. I want you to buy Louder and Bombs and get well schooled in the kinds of things that I'm talking about. But I also want you to drink lots of water, do yoga, hike, do fun things, be affectionate with people, eat, good food and nutritious food, and go to dance. Participate in art as much as you can, museums, poetry readings, films. All of these things are very, very creative, and it's through this creativity that we can also overcome a lot of the darkness that's out there. Because there is, as Gramsci said, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. I've kind of changed that. I've edited that because will strikes me as too Nietzschean. And now I say pessimism of the intellect. I mean, we see the problems in front of us, but optimism of the heart, And as Rumi says, when the people of the truth, the seekers of the truth come together, that's when the work is unveiled. So when you come to meetings like this, if you come to other talks and events, you find that you're not alone. You're not isolated. One of the systems, one of the mechanisms of control that power exercises over our population is to convince them that they are isolated, that you are just one person. There's no one else like you. No one else is worried about global warming or ozone depletion or the Iraq war or maybe an attack on Iran or Afghanistan or any of these other things. Just worry about yourself. Just look after number one, Do what's right for you. Focus on, Janet Jackson's, wardrobe malfunction at the Super Bowl and how awful that was, or the latest Hollywood film and who's getting divorced. Did Kobe Bryant do it? Was he really guilty? Let's talk about that. And all these other trivialities that we get caught up in. So I think art, very important. This is Marge Piercy from her collection The Moon is Always Female. It's called The Low Road. What can they do to you? Whatever they want. They can set you up, they can bust you, they can break you, they can burn your brain with electricity. Alone you can fight them, you can refuse, you can take revenge what you can, but they roll over you. But two people fighting back to back can make a difference. Two people can keep each other sane, can give support, conviction, love, massage, hope, sex. Three people are a delegation, a committee, a wedge. With four, you can play bridge and start an organization. With six, you can rent a whole house, eat pie for dinner with no seconds, and hold a fundraising party. A dozen make a demonstration. 50 fill a hall. 1,000 have solidarity. 10,000 your own newsletter. 100,000 your own media. 10 million your own country. It goes on one at a time. It starts when you care to act. It starts when you do it again after they said no. It starts when you say we and know who you mean, and each day you mean one more. Thank you very much.